Good afternoon, everyone. As screens are joining us, and I'm just changing my name because that might be more helpful. Very good to see you. Happy New Year to those who are still celebrating such things. David McInnes, we can see that you're with us, but I might ask you to start your video. Welcome, whether you've been to several of these before or not. But I'm Christopher, Director of Resource, and thrilled that John Maiden from the Open University is with us again to lead us through another series of three witness seminars. Some of you have been involved with those that we did previously, and here is one other guest for this afternoon. That's good. And we're continuing now this new year. So, hello, Bishop Graham. Good to see you.
Thank you.
I will, without further ado, throw over to John Maiden and look forward to being led through this time together. Thanks, John, for being with us again.
Thank you, Christopher, and the other members of the Resource Steering Committee. It's great to be at the beginning of another series of three of these witness seminars. I didn't really envisage we'd go beyond the three that we had last year, but they went so well. Here we are at what feels like the beginning of a new season. To use the footballing terminology, and really looking forward to these next three seminars. Christopher, perhaps if we could have the PowerPoint. Our seminar today is on the what has been known as the Toronto Blessing in the UK. I'll just introduce myself. I'm the head of department for religious studies at the Open University. Most of my research is on charismatic evangelical Christianity. And in these witness seminars, what we're trying to do really is focus our thoughts on a particular event or a particular issue. I will provide some background contextual material, but the idea really is for people who were involved in these events or had a kind of stake in a particular issue to bring their own recollections, their own memories, but also after what is a number of decades in this case, their thoughts on the legacy and afterlife of particular events. Next slide, please, Christopher. So in this discussion of the Toronto Blessing, I'm just going to refer to it as the Toronto Blessing. Not everyone would understand it to be a blessing. I'm just going to refer to it as the Toronto Blessing with no judgment whatsoever. What we're going to do is I will say a few things about the background and the context of Toronto. Then very kindly, Bishop Dow has agreed to share some of his recollections and thoughts on the Toronto Blessing. And then we'll move into a discussion where we can all share as we would like to. Just a reminder that we are recording this session, and the recording will ultimately be made available to anyone who is interested in this topic, whether for research or for whatever. So if you're not happy to be recorded, best to leave the session now because it will be recorded. Next slide, please. Christopher. Okay, so what can we say about the Toronto blessing? Well, everything. I'm just going to give for the fourth time a quick plug for my book. If you want to know a bit more about some of the history of charismatic renewal, both in the UK and far beyond, do take a look at this book. It's gradually dropping in price. I'm pleased to say. So it might be that a time will come where you don't have to remortgage your house to buy a copy. But I would be thrilled if you could pick up a copy and have a read. I think it would interest you. So the Toronto blessing. In January 1994, a revivalistic phenomenon appeared to have broken out at the Toronto Airport Vineyard Church. The Toronto blessing became synonymous with the experience of soaking in God's love, of healings, slayings in the spirit, and manifestations such as laughter, spiritual quote-unquote drunkenness, and even, as the secular press and religious press was very keen to point out, animal noises. What was the background to this? Well, laughter. In fact, laughter and the more extraordinary aspects of the blessing had been occasionally evident in global charismatic movements for many years before. Reports of early charismatic meetings in the UK sometimes describe descriptions of holy mirth in the spirit. I think that was Michael Harper's description back in the early 1960s of holy mirth at a prayer meeting. An article in the American charismatic magazine Logos Journal in 1973 said as follows: "To know God as our Holy Father is to be infinitely happy, to be filled with rollicking mirth, a holy hilarity at the sheer circumstances of living for Christ." So there is a precedent for some of the characteristics that have been associated with Toronto. More immediately, the origins of the Toronto blessing can be traced through various linkages. Argentinian Pentecostalism was influential. The airport church pastor, John Arnott, had witnessed the ministry of the Assemblies of God, Pastor Hector Jimenez, whose church was known for laughter in the spirit. The healing evangelist Benny Hinn, formerly of the Toronto Catacombs charismatic prayer meeting, had been prayed for by Arnott in 1993. Another vineyard pastor, Randy Clark, who was a speaker at some of the first Toronto Airport vineyard meetings, was influenced by Rodney Howard-Browne, a South African who before emigrating to the United States had taught at the Rhema Bible School in South Africa. Howard-Browne was also known for promoting laughter in the spirit. And as news of the blessing spread, the Airport Vineyard Church became a kind of global destination for charismatics interested in seeing what God might be doing in other parts of the world. And there have been other global locations before Toronto which had attracted charismatics from overseas. Thinking of Melodyland, for example, in Anaheim, which has come up in previous seminars, or Church of the Redeemer in Houston. Very often these places have been in North America, I think it's fair to say. So what about the reception in the UK? Well, the Church of England was an important setting for the Toronto blessing in the UK. In fact, Toronto blessing as a title was coined by the British media. It was the British media who coined the term after the blessing had been experienced at Holy Trinity Brompton in 1994, apparently through the witness of Eleanor Mumford. Now, the Toronto blessing in the UK was also to have a significant impact on the new apostolic networks which had been developing over the previous decade. New Frontiers, for example, was markedly influenced by Toronto. In the book, I talk about a meeting of 250 New Frontiers leaders in 1994 who experienced the blessing. And Terry Virgo, the leader, introduced this, and they were outdoors at the time, introduced the song Singing in the Rain. And he recalled 250 men began to dance and sing. Gene Kelly never knew such joy in abandonment. Was this really 250 Englishmen? And New Frontiers leaders took aspects of the blessing to other British congregations, but also abroad, Cape Town, Bombay, other places. So Toronto was important as well to charismatics outside of the mainline churches. It could be divisive. I think we're probably all aware of some of the divisions which emerged over Toronto. For some, it was undoubtedly a revival moment. For others, it was a classic example of charismatic deception. So opinion was divided over this. But opinion also became divided in charismatic circles. And it's interesting that although the airport church was a vineyard church at the time of the beginning of the Toronto blessing, by 1996 there was a formal separation between Vineyard's board and council and the airport church. And Wimber is quoted as saying that the Vineyard wanted to maintain a focus on the main and plain things in Scripture. So there was division over Toronto as well. And then my final point here is legacy, question mark. I'm going to say very little about that, other than that in my kind of personal life, many friends of mine, I think it's fair to say, were significantly impacted by Toronto. And actually, some would trace a kind of new direction or new emphasis in their ministry to those early years of the Toronto blessing. So I think it's a movement, it's a phenomenon that must be treated seriously, because it has been, according to the testimonies that I have heard, a real catalyst for something new in the churches. So I'm going to hand over to Bishop Graham now, and looking forward to what you have to say to us, Bishop.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I'm surprised to have been asked to say something, and indeed I only heard 2 weeks ago by accident from David McInnes, and I only got my Zoom connection this morning. So I'm not quite sure whose idea it was to ask me, and I don't know that I can add actually very much to what you said, John. I do remember the time when it was widely reported that powerful experiences of the Spirit were being had at the Toronto Vineyard, and that Eleanor Mumford, people of course flocked then from all over the world, and Eleanor went and came back to Holy Trinity Brompton, and the Spirit fell. And I think people were touched there. I was Bishop of Wilsden at the time. I don't remember how it affected churches in the Wilsden area, except that Bruce Collins at Christchurch Roxeth was clearly, I think he probably went, he was certainly impacted by it all, and he arranged for me and my wife to go over to the airport church in August. As it turned out, the church were away at camp, and there was a kind of B team there, and some of the same phenomena were happening, not perhaps as strongly as they had done when the whole church was there. It didn't actually impact me greatly. I did rest in the Spirit. I don't remember anything surprising or new particularly. And my wife just caught a bad cold, which unfortunately spoiled the occasion. We did have a very nice trip to the Niagara Falls and also to the that community who live very simply. I've forgotten their name. So I haven't got that much to say, but the rumors about the barking noises, for example, the animal noises, didn't put me off believing that this was primarily a tremendous work of God, because I'm prepared for the Spirit to do what the Spirit likes. I just love hearing of the power of God, and clearly a lot of people, as you've said, were wonderfully touched by visits there, and indeed by its impact in Britain. We need the power of God so much. We desperately want the kingdom of God to be seen. Some people were put off by the manifestations, and you've mentioned that being argued as deception, and indeed that was true of Peter Horrobin from L.L. Grange, who's a very good personal friend of mine. He took the view as it was a negative view. But there was so much good about it, and I believe it's true that Heidi Baker had an extraordinarily powerful experience there, coming back exhausted from Mozambique. And I think she was rigid for a day or so under the impact, but was in the end wonderfully restored. And but it had knocked her out for a day or so. And I'm just glad about that, because she's had the most remarkable ministry in Mozambique, as many of you will know. And if it blessed her by coming to the airport church, well and good. I also have a very positive view of John Arnott, who contributed recently to a sort of reminder of those days, which was organized from Redding in California. And John Arnott spoke at one of those occasions, and I just feel that he's utterly genuine. Probably HTB would say it had a profound effect on their people, as you said, John. But basically, thinking about it, while it didn't have a remarkable effect on me, as for example John Wimber did, stories like the Toronto blessing just make me long more and more for the kingdom to be poured out in the power of God. And that's really all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Graham. It's good to hear from someone who visited Toronto and saw some of these things firsthand, even if your wife caught a bad cold. And sorry to hear about that. Sorry, Christopher, if we could go back to the, I think it's the final PowerPoint slide. Now, as ever, well, I should just say, actually, I will, on this occasion, I'm going to need to leave this discussion slightly early today. I have to go and pick up my daughter from school. So I'm going to be leaving around 3 o'clock. But we do intend to carry on past 3 o'clock till about 3:30. And when I leave, Christopher we will seamlessly move over to Christopher's chairmanship. So I won't say goodbye. I will just drop out and leave it to Christopher. But as ever, although I've got a kind of structure here for us to move through today, I only suggest we keep to this broadly. If there are other things that people want to talk about, then it's fine to do that. This is really just to kind of keep us moving and touching on some of the, I suppose, larger issues around Toronto. So first of all, starter for one, could we talk about just our experience of the conferences and of going to Vineyard, of going to the Toronto Airport Vineyard, if anyone travelled to Toronto, or any experiences of attending churches or conferences where it was felt that the blessing had broken out in the mid-1990s. So just to begin with people's experiences would be good. I will be quiet until someone raises their hand or dives in. John Coles.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you. Thank you for your invitation to join with you. Toronto hit me before I hit Toronto. We had a visit from a vineyard pastor who'd been there to our church in North London. It's a vineyard pastor that we'd had frequent relationship with over the preceding 10 years. And the evening that we cancelled our midweek meetings and we held all our home groups together, invited some other people from North London as well. It was the most remarkable evening of the presence of God overwhelming us. So that would be my first comment. This is about the presence of the Father who loves his children with a love that empowers them. So it was not surprising then when I had the chance to go to, offered to me to go to Toronto, that I went with my wife. And again, the Spirit fell on us before we actually got to the meeting in the hotel room. I was sitting at a desk, my wife was sitting on the bed, and suddenly we both found ourselves weeping, aware that the Spirit of God was embracing us. One of my experiences at the meeting was a sense that I was meeting with and seeing Jesus with greater clarity as the Lord than for many years. I was being refreshed in my relationship with him. When you've been leading ministry, for numbers of years, then not as acutely as Heidi Baker, but I certainly found it a most refreshing visit to Toronto. And one of the things that I felt the Lord said to me was that the ministry was going to go to the nations. And I didn't really know what that meant at that moment, but only on coming back did that become clearer over the next few years. And I don't know whether I'm allowed to go on to that point or not yet, because I've just talked about the first bit is actually a reflection on going there. So maybe I shall wait until I say what that meant. I discovered that meant later.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. There's plenty of time to come back to that. And thanks for sharing that. So, I mean, by the sounds of it, you're saying that you experienced something of that same encounter with God's presence before you were aware of the Toronto blessing phenomenon, and
well,
but through a vineyard, the influence of a vineyard ministry.
Yeah, the vineyard pastor had told me that he had been to the vineyard and had a special meeting with God. Right. And he'd love us to experience the same thing. He was visiting England, and so we put together this midweek meeting.
Thank you. Who would like to speak next? Susan, Hope.
Yes, nice to see some friends there. Lovely to be with you. Yes, I went to the Airport Vineyard in August '94, having heard Ellie's tape, which had come from HTB and was circulating the churches. And one of the things that I feel about or realised about Toronto is it was very much people coming and it was like the fire being spread through individuals. Like John had that pastor coming to his church and the power fell. Same thing through the tape. I lent it to a very straight-laced church warden that I'd got in Sheffield at the time. And I said, Margaret, just see what you think of this. And as she rang up about 2 hours later, and she said, Susan, I've got one question. When are we going? And so we took a team from the church. 5 of us went. And we were overwhelmed, both in our hotel rooms, but obviously also in the vineyard itself. In the week that we were there was a German man visiting who had been deaf from childhood, and as he walked into the vineyard, his ears popped and he could hear. And it was absolutely extraordinary to hear that testimony. I mean, actually, he couldn't stand the noise, in fact, as you'll appreciate, but it was a remarkable thing. And I would say I had a dream in 1990 that basically, though I was in Christian ministry, I was going in the wrong direction. I think I was playing a bit fast and loose with a sort of career in the church. And I had been praying for 4 years, Lord, he'd shown me in this dream I was going the wrong way. And I prayed, Lord, just turn me round. I don't know how to get off this. Turn me round. And all I could say is that really the vineyard, that experience, that week there, just turned me round. I mean, I spent lots of time on the floor, soaking, weeping, listening to God, overpowered really by his presence. And that turned me round. And I came back rejoicing and started to share it, as did many other people.
Thank you, Susan. Would anyone else like to speak of their experience of encountering the Toronto blessing? Michael Mitten. Hi, Michael.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was director of Anglican Renewal Ministries at the time. I think slightly skeptical when I first heard reports. Listened to Ellie Mumford's tape on my way back I was speaking at the Manchester Renewal Group that day on surviving in the wilderness, and speaking somewhat from personal experience. And in those days it was a cassette tape. Very much was impressed by Ellie's testimony. I then did have good friends like Sue Hope, who's just spoken, who spoke so powerfully about her experience. And in the end, I found myself leading a group of 18 of us, actually, and mostly Anglican leaders, over to Toronto. It was a very special week because we were all from different parts of the UK, different ages, different experiences, to some extent, different churchmanships. Most of us were very deeply impacted. What was so useful was having people there could help us in the evenings just to theologically reflect on what we were experiencing. I think in the end, we all agreed our experiences were varied, but our conviction was there was something extraordinary going on, sent by heaven to refresh the church at this time. Personally, I felt very deeply renewed and impacted by the love of God. And I really enjoyed the laughing. I mean, I used to go around and say, the Anglicans have been praying for centuries, Lord, make thy chosen people joyful. We should expect him to answer that at some point. And I used to love going to the meetings and experiencing the laughter because, frankly, an awful lot of meetings I'd been to before of more formal kinds didn't have quite enough for me. So there was one benefit in that way.
Thank you, Michael. Good to know you enjoyed the holy mirth. Anyone else like to come in at this point? All right. If not, I do have a couple of follow-on questions, but would anyone else like to come in? Okay. Well, from those Bishop Graham's reflections and those other three reflections there, I mean, one thing that has come up a number of times is a sense of the situation before Toronto. A number of people have talked about a kind of fatigue, perhaps, in ministry, or a sense of feeling lost in their ministry. And it seems that in some ways, the encounter with the Toronto blessing has refreshed people's ministry. The second thing that I noticed and it's something that I've thought about quite a bit in relation to Toronto, is this question of proximity. And this idea that you go to Toronto in order to experience this blessing. or even that you, I mean, even perhaps through the technology, to listen to a cassette from someone who's been there, who can testify to it. And I just wondered, I suppose, theologically or in terms of your own experience, what was it about proximity? What was it about being there, or the kind of the blessing moving through people or being taken back somewhere else? I mean, are there any examples, for example, of the Toronto blessing arriving in a church when no one has been to Toronto? Perhaps people have heard about it, but no one's been there and no one's come from there. Would anyone like to come in on those questions? Sylvia.
Yep. At the time, I was team rector of 6 churches, 3 of which were on a council estate. And in our deanery, there were 5 council estates. We were known as the poorest deanery in the diocese, and there was no way anyone would even go to a big meeting, let alone go over to Toronto. So the clergy just decided that we would have our own meetings in our deanery, and we had 3 deanery meetings. And I remember taking something like 30 of one of our church to it. They had no idea what they were going to or what to expect. And they all did what we used to call carpet time. They all ended up on the floor, incredibly blessed by God. There was a real sense of God's power and love there. And they just hadn't a clue what was supposed to happen. So the fact that it did happen was really a sign that it came from God. And I have to say, it transformed the church. There was no doubt about it. Because they were council estate folk and because a number of them couldn't read and write, they experienced God before they knew what happened elsewhere and before they knew that it might have something to do with the Bible. And they also had a sort of sense of being second-class citizens because of their intellectual backgrounds. And so it gave them that real sense of value that God actually was doing something with them, which we were then able to say, actually, this is happening globally. And also it can be tied in with the Bible. And so it gave them that real sense of value and purpose. And it actually changed, particularly our midweek prayer meetings, because suddenly they were able to minister to each other with a confidence that they'd never had before. So for us, I think it was really quite a life-changing thing. And they had no idea about Toronto or anything else, just what they experienced in our own churches, in our own deanery.
Thank you, Sylvia. That's fascinating because so often, I suppose, in the kind of representation of what was happening at the time and since, it's been presented as very much a kind of middle class phenomenon. So to hear about meetings in this work, and which deanery, do you mind me asking? Where were you?
We're in something called Nottingham North.
Right. Okay.
And it was 5 council estates, and we all joined together for these meetings. I don't know what happened in the other churches, but I know what happened in our team, and it was really transforming.
And no one from Toronto came to the deanery. It was
no, just one of our own clergy did a talk and then just said we're going to have ministry, and that, that's just what happened.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come in? Michael.
Sorry, just briefly. I think it was both and, because certainly I think there was a kind of pilgrimage discipline, and that is people going to either Toronto, New Wine, or other locations where they were reasonably assured there was going to be something of that ministry offered, and they went with a particular intention. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's well-established pilgrimage discipline. But certainly I heard reports, I'm just thinking of a vicar down in Exeter at the time, who certainly hadn't been to any meeting. He was an Anglo-Catholic minister, didn't have a great interest in it, actually, but in his own prayer time, found himself initially weeping and then rolling around in his study in hysterical laughter. And he certainly attributed it to the gift of the Holy Spirit. And he said it was quite transforming for him. So there was, for me, that was evidence that there was some move of the Spirit going on that wasn't dependent on us having to go to locations to receive it.
Mm. And was there a sense of, would anyone be able to speak to that sense of going on a pilgrimage to Toronto, and how you kind of thought about that at the time, and what that pilgrimage involved? I mean, it's interesting as well that two people have spoke about the presence of feeling the presence of the Spirit in their hotel rooms before they're even at any of the meetings. Could anyone speak to that?
I could say that although I heard the Ellie Mumford tape, I'd also obviously heard about Toronto, and I was a member of the General Synod at the time. And there was a little part of me that was not the personal bit, but was thinking, I need to check this out. I need to check this out. This is big and I need to check it out. So there was a sort of objective purpose for going. I mean, is this bona fide? Is it, is it accountable? Is it, So, and I would think that there were quite a few people, not a few people who would go with that sort of, I just need to look at this, see where it's coming from. I would think I wasn't the only one to do that. Having said that, it was all just swept aside as soon as I went. But that was certainly part of the pilgrim, part of the reason, the need to go. As a kind of responsible action, if you want.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, and I've certainly come across other pastors who they would say their initial reason for going was to kind of check up on this. What was it sound? I'm going to hand over to John now, John Coles.
What is the motivation for any of us to go on a pilgrimage? It's a desire for a deepening of our relationship with God, I think. And often a pilgrimage is something that we engage in because somebody else has recommended it to us as having been of value to them. So we might find ourselves attempting a type of meditation or prayer or silent retreat that we've never done before because somebody else we know and trust has said, this has been so valuable to me. And I think it was for that reason, partly, that I went. I don't know that I'd seriously noticed that verse in Psalm 84, which talks about blessed are those whose hearts are set on pilgrimage. But I certainly came back with that awareness that actually my heart had longed for more, and I'd gone and received something of the more that I'd been praying for.
Thank you, John. I'm going to go to Jenny, and then I'm going to Bishop Graham.
My experience, it seems to be a little bit between those. Sylvia's with their deanery. I think that Toronto, there were teams that came over here. And so I was in Norfolk, and there was a 2-day conference, I think it was, in Norwich, not a residential conference. And my experience really amazing to hear John Cole's experience. But my experience that there was a physical phenomenon that I experienced, which was one of being on the floor and of being rolled one way and then the other, just of allowing God by His Spirit to be willing to move. But I found myself being rolled from one side to the other. I do not know what it meant. I searched the scriptures to find some sort of explanation. I think Toronto was one more thing, really. I found Wimber's ministry was really profound for me. And the Toronto, in fact, I wondered what had happened. and discovered when I looked online that Catch the Fire Toronto was actually sort of celebrating 30 years. 30 years, can it be that? No, 25 years since that outpouring. So it was an experience that happened, but I don't know that I see any not a profound experience, but it was somewhere between people's, not going on pilgrimage, but simply going to a local conference. That was my experience.
Thank you, Jenny. Bishop Graham.
Well, as I've shared with you, I went at the recommendation of Bruce Collins, and I went because I trusted him and really learned a lot from him. He was one of my vicars in Willesden. But I think there probably was an element in me of wanting to check it out. And I have wondered a great deal why it didn't impact me more. Was it because the team were away at camp, or was it because my expectation wasn't high enough? And I don't know the answers to those. I don't think I was in a dry and difficult place because actually I'd been Bishop of Willesden since 1992, and I've only ever had one dramatic experience happen to me in my spiritual life, and that was actually on the retreat before my consecration as Bishop of Willesden, which was at St. Binos. And it happened that I was given a passage to study each day, as some of you may know. And on the Sunday, towards the end of the week, I sat down on the floor, and it was the passage of Jesus coming in the upper room. And all I can say is the Spirit took me there. And I was crying out and saying, it's really true, everything's possible. And it was undoubtedly a huge anointing of God just before I began as Bishop of Willesden. So I had that, and I still have that experience, the only one I've ever had that I would regard as dramatic. But I don't know why I didn't get more at Toronto, but maybe I didn't need it. I don't know. Perhaps some of you can help me with that. But I had experienced a powerful experience 2 years before at St. Binos.
Thank you for sharing that. Would anyone else like to come in? Sally.
Thank you. Yeah, interestingly, just to pick up on that, we moved to Kenya in January 1994, and I remember feeling very disappointed when I read in the Church Times several weeks late about what was going on. So when we came home that summer to continue our fundraising, the two of us and a couple of friends, we all set off one Sunday evening to HTB to see if we could get it, the thing, And I nothing much happened for any of us. I think our two friends were very skeptical, but I really wanted something to happen, and it didn't. And then I thought, my reflection afterwards was just, well, maybe I wanted it too much, or maybe that's the wrong attitude. It's like, there's something wrong with me that I didn't get the thing. And I wonder how much that was an issue for people who really wanted something to happen, not because necessarily felt desperately in need, but any spiritual experience going, I'm definitely up for it. And I didn't get it, and maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, thank you, Sally, because I was about to ask actually, did anyone, to use your words, try to get this experience and not get it? Or did anyone come away from Toronto kind of unconvinced? And that's a really, by the sounds of it, you weren't unconvinced, but you just didn't have that experience that others had, perhaps. So thank you, David.
Yeah, we went to HTB in '94 to try and get the blessing. Nothing particularly happened. I had a sabbatical the following year, so we went around went to Anaheim and other hotspots in the US. We didn't go to Toronto, but there was, the blessing was happening in various churches around America when we went to, and each time we were expecting something powerful to happen, which didn't really. When we came back, there were a series of renewals in the northeast, and based in Sunderland with Ken Gott, and he had conferences every year, which came out of the Toronto Blessing. Again, we went there every year, great thing, but somehow this extraordinary thing I was heard about didn't actually happen to me. I mean, I've been blessed many times in the past, but this super duper Toronto thing, to all the many meetings I went to, didn't quite happen. I mean, I assume I just didn't need it, but that was my experience. It was all great, but this super duper thing didn't quite happen.
Thank you, David. Okay, well, Felicity, please. I'm sorry to say it, but you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I remember going down for a spring harvest preparation day and going to HTB with a friend beforehand, in which clearly God was working there, and a lot of people were touched. I went forward for ministry and had a sense of God's presence, but nothing spectacular. And then in the May, I went with a couple of friends to Toronto Vineyard, slightly checking it out as other people have done, and but open to whatever God had got. And it was a very pleasant time of meeting with God, I would say, without being a spectacular time at all. But what I came away with was I was impressed with the pastoral wisdom of the people there, dealing with folk who were manifesting in extraordinary ways. And in particular, when they thought that somebody was putting it on, what they used to do was take them off to a side room. And they said, it's amazing how quickly the manifestations stop if you're not being watched. And that spoke to me very powerfully about some of the maturity of the leadership there, along with some of the teaching and other things that went on. So I was pleased I went. I can't say that it had a spectacular effect on my life or ministry, but I came away thinking, yeah, there's probably some bits that are not of God, but an awful lot of this is of God.
That's what I felt.
Thank you, Felicity. Okay, well, I think I mean, we can always come back to our kind of individual experiences of Toronto and the Toronto Blessing. But I think we'll move on to my kind of second question, which was about wider responses to Toronto. In the Toronto Blessing was highly contested, both in the national press, but also within denominations and in individual churches, and even between charismatic Christians. So, would anyone would like to speak to some of that controversy of the time, and perhaps what do you think made the Toronto Blessing controversial, where it was controversial? Richard.
Yeah, can I answer that just by giving my experience of it, which was that I first heard of the Toronto Blessing when I was on sabbatical at the Champagne Vineyard in Illinois in '94, came back, attended a Hensel retreat where John White, who I think was in the Willesden area, had experience and talked about laughing a lot. And then in Hull, we decided to hold a meeting in the City Hall, which actually I led. And I can't remember very dramatic things happening. I think some people rested in the spirit. I know a man had a depression completely lifted that he'd had for many years. So there were miracles happening, but I wouldn't say huge amount that was overt. I heard the Ellie Mumford tape and invited local vineyard people to come to our church for an evening meeting. And actually, it didn't go very well. Some of the people just went around waving their arms, saying they were helicopters waving the spirit on people. And my people rather reacted against. Then I was involved in discussions with people who thought, well, all these people going around like snakes and so on, that surely that's demonic, and people didn't know how to sort of attribute that to the Holy Spirit. And so I was in a state of being a little bit anti for a while, and I'd heard Clifford Hill's comments. And then I ended up in Colombia 2002 with Robert Ward to see the revival there. And after the second day, Robert said, we've got these pastors from Toronto, they want to ride in our bus. Do you have any objection? And so I seated myself next to one of them, I think his name was Duncan, and he explained it to me, and actually he resolved all my issues. And I later on picked up a book by John Arnott at New Wine. I've got it here, Manifestations and Prophetic Symbolism, which actually does give a very good explanation of the sort of weirder manifestations. And basically the gist is, this is our human emotions reacting to what the Spirit does. And I was very involved in Alpha actually from 1995 on, and I saw quite a few unusual things happen when people were prayed for, both at HTB conferences and at healing evenings and Holy Spirit days, which I led. I don't know whether you could directly attribute those to Toronto, but we did see a number of things happen and see a lot of lives transformed.
Thank you, Richard. That's very helpful. Would anyone else like to come in at this point? Alan.
Yeah, hi everybody. I thought it might be worth just saying something about my experience of the ripple effects of the Toronto blessing. I was curate in charge of a small church plant on the edges of Barnstaple on a new housing estate there. Fairly mixed congregation, lower middle class perhaps, if you wanted to generalize. And a friend of mine, Jonathan, was a fellow curate. So he, I think, with his incumbent, they were from St Andrew's, Clumpton, they'd gone and come back. And I thought, well, let's invite them along to our church and see if they can minister to us, and something of what they experienced could come to us through them. And they came. The spirit was invited and fell in a very dramatic way on a lot of people. I mean, my wife, Wendy and I were talking about it beforehand, and she said she didn't feel affected in any particular way, but some people had a really deep encounter. There were the vicar from Clumpton, he spoke prophetic words over people, which were remarkably insightful and accurate and actually life-changing for at least two people. But coming back to the point we're discussing about the controversial aspects of it, there was one family, so actually two generations of the same family, but they left the church because they just couldn't handle these manifestations. They just couldn't see that was godly at all. And I was quite upset at the time, because if you've got sort of 30, 40 people in the church and a dozen of them go, it makes a big impact on the church as a whole. But when I reflected on it later, I thought, well, actually, I'm not judging them in any particular way, but they had a brethren background. I don't think they were really embracing the things of the spirits anyway. And I think they probably weren't happy with the direction of travel of the church. And it was perhaps a catalyst for them just to make a decision that might have happened a few months later anyway. But for the most part, it was a very positive experience. And I can think of one or two people, one who experienced physical healing, one who experienced a large amount of healing from childhood abuse. So very powerful, positive effect for the majority, but one or two folks just couldn't cope with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. No, anyone else like to come in? Perhaps someone who, well, I can go to John, and then perhaps someone who hasn't spoken yet. If you'd like to, then it'd be great to hear from you. But John, or you're muted. Sorry.
First reflection is that we held meetings frequently in our church for months afterwards, to which we invited anyone and everyone to come, which was for many a tremendous blessing, and included for those we held for church leaders, some people who I wouldn't have dreamt would have coming. And I remember being very shocked when somebody from a very much more Anglo-Catholic background just knelt down in front of me and said, "Please pray for me, please pray for me." It was as if God was igniting a desire in some people that I wouldn't have credited would have come to me as a means through which some of their hunger for him might be satisfied. And normally, as we prayed with people, some would respond. So I'm saying there that God went beyond the expectations of my expectations of those who he might touch or who were seeking for a refreshment in him. In contrast to that, in the autumn of '94, we went to Northern Ireland with David Pitchers for a Hensel, and it was in some ways the most dramatically powerful of all the clergy retreats that I remember helping him with. Literally, people were bouncing on the floor. We were meeting in an upper room in a church hall, and it was the nearest I've ever got to. The place was shaken. And it was shaken as much by people bouncing on the floor as by any sort of other power of the spirit. But the lives of many of those people were really changed. But very quickly, at the same time, and because the Toronto Blessing had publicity by that stage, this was October '94 when we were there, in the Christian press in Northern Ireland, there was a lot of commentary against the Toronto Blessing. So we were experiencing in front of our eyes some people whose lives were being transformed. One of the bishops in Northern Ireland in the Anglican Church, David Maclay, that was a life transforming moment for him. He'd recently been bereaved; his wife had died of cancer. He got completely restored in relationship with the Lord. A lot of his grief was taken from him, and his existing ministry was further enriched and empowered. He's now the bishop of Down and Dromore. But at the same time, others were reacting fairly violently against it, describing it as the work of the devil. I think a year later, within maybe 18 months after Toronto started for us, we took a team to Finland, and we went to a number of churches. And by the time we left Finland, there were articles in the evangelical press about our visits into one or two of the early churches we'd been to at the beginning, and much of that was highly critical of what they had seen, and a lot of it was to do with manifestations, people falling, which was for Finnish culture, even church culture, even more unknown, at least Finnish Lutheran culture, even more unknown than was in Anglican circles in England. So the expression of emotion associated with it, I think, was one of the things that some people found quite offensive and ascribed to the enemy rather than understood that emotions are actually given to us by God. And ultimately, if we can't laugh together in the presence of the God who is the source of all joy, when is it that it is appropriate to laugh?
Thank you, John. And some of those criticisms do have echoes of the criticisms of the early Methodists, overly enthusiastic.
Yeah.
I would like, if I may, to put David McInnes on the spot. And he's laughing, so I think it's okay. But David, I wonder if you could talk to us about the impact of Toronto on St. Aldate's.
Yes, it's very interesting because we didn't have anybody who went to Toronto, or at least that's not entirely true. Two of our members did go at a later date after the spirit had really moved in the church. But I think that the initial thing for us, we had Ellie Mumford's tape about her experience, and we played it at our staff meeting and gave ourselves a prayer following that. Nothing particularly happened at that stage, although we were excited, I think. Then during August, we always had meetings for the whole church in our church hall, because a lot of people were away on holiday. And towards the end of that month, we were having an ordinary meeting, and after one of my curates had spoken, the Holy Spirit fell on us, and the whole crowd of about 50 people or 60 people collapsed in different directions. I remember one young lady hanging onto the windowsill to try and stop herself from falling completely. And we realized this was the beginnings of a move of the Spirit. The following week, the hall was packed to the doors. It hadn't affected the church congregation at that point, but the following week we had some rather unsavory characters who also turned up, who we had to eject from the room. But we had again a great move of the Spirit, and everybody in that crowd was falling about the place, and we saw wonderful things happening in their lives. Meanwhile, we hosted the Vineyard, who wanted to have a meeting of their own, and they met in St. Aldate's. And I remember Ellie imitating a chimpanzee in one corner, and it was a rather chaotic meeting, which left some of our folk thinking we don't really want this. And however, then a week or two later, we had a move happened in the church, and at the end of a service, people remained standing, and then one or two collapsed in their seats, and there was a huge sense of the presence of God being there. We, at that point, also, my wife and I had some extraordinary messages from the Lord, which basically were calling us to repentance and for the whole church to repent. And that led into a period for the next year in which there was an extraordinary move of the Spirit, which caused a lot of upset and disturbance in one way or another, but also huge blessing. And whereas we'd had a few people coming forward for prayer every Sunday, we suddenly found ourselves having 100 or more coming forward, and all our ministry teams had to be changed. So it was an extraordinary period altogether. And by the end of the year, there was a real change in the church, and we rewrote our main values, and we found ourselves forming new forms of fellowship group and so on. So it had a dramatic effect, which continued over the following years.
Thank you very much, David. Now I'm going to pass the baton on to Christopher now, but it would be good to move on, I think, to that final question about legacy, and one. I hope to kind of listen to this later, but I think as part of that, it would be interesting, I think, to talk about, I suppose, one of the criticisms from within the church about Toronto has sometimes been inward looking. And I suppose a movement for kind of restoration, renewal, rather than a kind of outward looking revivalistic movement. It would be interesting to know whether you think that that's a fair critique. It's one of the common critiques, I suppose. But I think as part of the discussion about legacy, if a number of people could speak to that, I think that could be quite interesting. But I'm going to pass over to Christopher now, and I hope the rest of the seminar goes well.
Thank you, John. Well, I mean, David, as a way into that, I wonder if you would like to just say a little bit more, as someone who some years later was on the staff of St. Aldate's for a few years, the decision you took to end all of the ministries, or most of the ministries, at that time. People still talked about that decades on, but how did that relate? What did you do, and how did it relate to Toronto, and what had happened subsequently?
Well, it was at the time where we were beginning to see the Spirit moving in the church hall. And one night, my wife and I found, I suppose about 2 a.m., the Lord began to speak to us very directly. I've never known it previously in my ministry in quite the same way. Once or twice, the Lord spoke it clearly, but he made it plain that he wanted the church to lay down their ministries at my feet, which I didn't fully understand at the time. But he then went on, the Lord went on to speak of what would happen, that the reactions there would be, and also challenged about a number of things that were wrong within the church. So I took that to the staff meeting that we had and shared it with them, and they agreed it was the Lord. So from that point on, we began what we called a closing down of ministries, where we shut down all the fellowship groups and brought the church together in the church hall. And that, of course, caused initially excitement, and then later it began to produce reactions, some very angry about it. The work continued for a year, during which every Sunday service we had at least 100 or so people would come forward for prayer, and quite dramatic things were happening at the front of the church. So it was a real movement of the Spirit going on. At the same time as we were being challenged, I think, about attitudes in Oxford, the pride and the arrogance and the individualism too. And by the end of the year, I think it was interesting. We had a PCC meeting, which we had to have accidentally in the midsummer, an annual general meeting, at which I listed 7 things that we learned from the period. And the PCC responded very warmly, saying, well, all we must do is pray. There was one church warden who hadn't been there, and when we had an AGM the following day, or I forget when it was, shortly afterwards, there were 1 or 2 people in the congregation who stood up and challenged me about what had happened, saying that it had been disastrous. And this church warden stood up and did exactly the same, said it was an own goal. This was followed by at least 30 or 40 people from the congregation standing up and just giving testimonies. And then it was an overwhelming thing, really. We lost about 20 people as a result of that, but really, and 1 or 2 lovely leaders too. But it was interesting that from that point on, there was a real united desire to go forward in the Lord. And we had extraordinary experiences of fasting in the following year during Lent and so on. It had a dramatic effect on the congregation.
I'd love to hear from some of the others who we've already heard from, or indeed if you're wanting to speak for the first time about impact and legacy. I mean, Sylvia, I was really fascinated by your own comments about your context, but Susan as well, perhaps, or any others, just that sense of what the lasting fruit or not, or legacy was.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something else. I mean, I think the lasting legacy was just that real sense that God valued them and they were important to God, and that actually, therefore, they could have a confidence in God. And so they started to minister to each other in ways that were incredible, ways that actually, as clergy, I couldn't, because they understood each other, perhaps because of their own backgrounds and upbringing. And they were given real gifts, some of them, and we saw healings. And it was actually there that Saints Alive was born for us. I mean, obviously, I'd worked with Saints Alive in other places before, but actually that we were able to start Saints Alive, and they could then, go on and learn to lead groups. We had people suddenly capable of leading groups. It was sometimes, I looked at it and thought, my goodness, what are they doing? But actually there was a power there that it didn't matter if they got it wrong sometimes. It didn't matter if they couldn't read what the Bible said, because they experienced God, they experienced his love, and they could pass that on. So I think actually for for the church, it was very important at that time that actually they actually had that confidence that God would be willing to actually give gifts to them. And it wasn't just this middle class Church of England that got all the gifts or got all the blessing. That was probably the legacy of it for us.
I mean, I think that question of, how do you be a true Christian these days if you can't read, is one of the sort of questions that often lies sort of hanging in the way that we just normally do church, isn't it? But that's really encouraging to hear.
But I think it's that, the fact that they could experience God and then see that it tied in with the Bible. And, I would sometimes sit and talk to them about what the Bible said. Oh, yeah, that's what we've had, Oh, that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael.
Thank you. I've got one theory, which may or may not be right, but it's an observation I think that I feel happened as a consequence of the Toronto blessing, in particularly the evangelical charismatic community. And that is, from around that time onwards, I see quite a shift of focus in the way we did mission. Before that, there was some what we used to call social action stuff, though that was usually viewed to be a bit of a liberal occupation. But the mission statement of the Toronto Church was to walk in the love of God and to give it away. And I think there was a real transformation in the hearts of many charismatics at the time to want to give the love of God away. And you see from that time the emergence of things like street pastors, food banks, and all sorts of other setting up of charities that were designed to really bless vulnerable people, either in our own communities or overseas, not for the sake of getting them into church, but really simply to show the love of God and to express the love of God the best way we knew how. I think that was one of the effects for me of the Toronto blessing.
I think that's very interesting, because it is remarkable the number of those movements in the last 20 years or so, isn't it? Susan, did you want to come in?
Well, I just want to really endorse what Michael said, because my observation of life since then is that countless, hundreds, if not thousands of people who were touched by the Toronto blessing have gone on to do significant work in mission. And to me, that is the great authenticator of the Spirit. The whole Fresh Expressions movement, all the things that Michael's mentioned, a real explosion of people who've ended up as missioners in the Church of England, or doing mission tasks, writing about it, exploring it, going as I think I think really that is the mark of approval. People say, "Where did it go?" Well, it went out. It went out of the church.
Yes.
And to me, that's what it was for, as well as blessing us, but it went out to the wider world.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that's true. I think one of the results of people experiencing the Spirit is that they are able to talk about it more easily, and they've got something to say. So it's exciting, and they tell their friends, and they tell strangers. And so we certainly found that happening, and it was clearly an outward move as a result.
John Coles, you wanted to come in as well.
I would affirm that, and I would affirm it in both people sharing their faith, really speaking about Jesus more confidently, and also engaging in the type of sharing the love of God through all sorts of other community events and programs. So, my wife, who was teaching part-time at that time, led two or three other teachers to the Lord, and there was a girl who, which was beyond her normal experience of, within a year or 2 year period. One of the younger women in the church, after the very first weekend where we were experiencing the outpouring of the Spirit, when she went to work the next day, she was an occupational therapist. Somebody said to her, "Well, what's happened to you? You look as if you've fallen in love." And it was the most natural opening to speak about experiencing the love of Jesus in a fresh way. She went on to become a missionary. She's only just returned to this country. from having spent all the time since then, I forget, nearly 25 years probably, in Cameroon, working with an unreached people group. And she got that call on her life during that time, as did about 8 other people in our church who went out to serve the Lord abroad. And we found ourselves planting churches in neighboring communities as from that time onwards. It was as if we couldn't contain it. There was something that we found ourselves caught up with, a movement of God, which meant that we had to be corporately on the move, and also our people found themselves being called to serve in other parts of the harvest field.
Thank you. I brought you back in, David, because but John Coles, you may have something to add on this, the question of really the unity and the relationship with the wider evangelical church and the wider church. John referenced this in relation to Northern Ireland. But I remember when I was at St Aldate's, it was a little project of mine to sort of chat to as many of the elder members of the congregation as possible to hoover up these memories. And one of the things somehow that really hit me was when a dear, very, very elderly woman spoke about the way in which people were praying for another church just down the road to receive the same blessing. And it didn't, at least in the same obvious way. But I wonder whether either of you want to reflect on, what to me now seems like quite often a sort of unspoken but significant divide between those evangelicals who were impacted and those who were not, or those who perhaps quite deliberately turned away from the possibility. Is that something you have anything to reflect on?
One of the effects that we noticed was that because there was quite a lot of chaos, in a sense, in St Aldate's, the very fact that there were lots and lots of people coming and falling on the ground and so on, and that some of the leadership were very angry about it too, that meant that local churches that had been rather put out by the fact that St Aldate's was the big church and rather dominated, suddenly became much more sympathetic to me. And I found myself getting opportunities of talking to them about this. And although I can't record any further wonderful developments in the other churches, it was very interesting that suddenly we were brought down to the level of another church because we were having a lot of trouble inside. And we'd given the impression of being such a great big liner, who would be so impervious to trouble. So our relationship was improved. But I don't think at the same time, unfortunately, they really grasped the nature of the move of the Spirit, which I'd love to have been able to convey. What was happening that those who were touched by the Spirit immediately wanted to talk about it. And so they were best evangelists we could have had.
Thank you.
I think that I didn't have the wisdom that David had. I was a much younger, more headstrong man back in the 90s than he probably was at St Aldate's. So I know that we didn't always steward it very well, and we didn't speak of the movement of the Spirit very well. So probably we were somewhat judgmental about people who weren't responding in the same way that we were, and that of course pushes people away rather than draws them further in. So we contributed to some of that division, is really what I'm saying, Christopher, in response to your comment. It's interesting that years later, some of those people are now much more, I'm in a closer relationship because I've stayed in North London all the time with some of those people than I was in those days. And whether that's partly because I'm not quite so much like a bull in the china shop as I used to be, or whether it's because of a change in them, or I'm not quite sure. But over a period of time, faithfulness to the Lord in all areas of life is actually something that draws people together. I think. So I think differences of focus on doctrine and practice in the immediate moment can divide, but over a period of time, some of those differences actually appear not to be as great as they did in the heat of the moment. And in our society today, there's so much going on, and in the wider church, there is so much going on, that those of us that love the Lord and see the authority of Scripture as essential, the Lordship of Jesus as being critical, and the need to be born again, we find ourselves closer to each other than we did over the particular manifestations of a movement of the Spirit in the 90s.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on these. It is the beginning of the week of prayer for Christian unity. So it may be a good day to be considering these themes or anything else that has come up. We're in the last 10 minutes now. So anything else that has come up and you feel would be helpful. John Finney, I'm pleased that you've raised a hand. I wasn't going to force you to contribute, but I was hoping that you might at some point.
Yes, if I can just go back for a little bit of history. Of course, in 1988, Lambeth decided that the last decade was going to be the decade of evangelism. And for my many sins, I was supposed to be in charge of it as far as the Church of England was concerned. And the thing which did strike me as soon as I began to talk, as of course my job was to talk to leaders in evangelism. And there several things struck me. First of all, virtually all of them had some charismatic background. Nearly all of them were able to look back to a time when the Holy Spirit had touched them in a very real and very personal way. And this had led them on into leadership and mission in one way or another. The other thing which struck me was that it was by no means just evangelical. There were a lot of people involved in the leadership of mission who came from an Anglo-Catholic or certainly middle of the church sort of position, who were enthusiastic about God and wanted to pass on the message. And I think sometimes the whole charismatic thing is seen as primarily evangelical, and it certainly wasn't in those days.
Yeah.
And I think that it may be something that we need to examine clearly, and maybe some of the reasons behind it is why, if you like, it has become to some extent seen as a primarily open evangelical movement. I think that it may even link back to the whole idea of pilgrimage, which we were talking about earlier, and the pilgrimage of whether it's Toronto or Walsingham. These are places where things happen, and the sense of the wholeness of the body of Christ is enormously important, and the whole question of charity between different opinions and so forth. Much more to say about that, but I think the sense of mission almost was born out of the charismatic movement of the 70s and 60s and 70s, and had enormous impact way outside the evangelical constituency.
Yes, I'd like to underline that I think the way in which the Fountain Trust operated drew together everything from the Orthodox Church to the most wild Pentecostals. And it was a very significant bringing together. I mean, Guildford in 1971 was a remarkable occasion because people found themselves at one in the spirit, although as far apart as the East is from the West, as far as doctrine was concerned. And so it was a significant recognition that God was bigger than our big divisions.
Susan, yes.
Well, just to thank you both for those comments. I am excited at the thought of the kind of Catholicity of this, you know, the unity, the koinonia, the unity, participation in the Spirit, that, and the fact that we are facing grievous issues at the moment is throwing up quite a lot of Anglo-Catholics as well who are engaging with us in various ways. So that's seeking for that unity and seeing what would emerge from it as a fresh wave is a great thought. And it is 30 years this May since we received Ellie Mumford's visit, I think. 30 years, isn't it? Since the Toronto blessing hit these shores.
Yes.
I mean, just to say that we're probably ready for another of some kind, but would we recognise it when it comes?
I feel it occurs to me that if anyone has Ellie Mumford's tape and would be willing to donate a copy, or we can try and get a copy made for our archive, it strikes me it's been raised as a significant artifact of this. Michael, do come in.
Just on dates, according to my records, it was the 20th of January 1994 that first significant renewal meeting took place at the Airport Vineyard Church. So that's 30 years ago tomorrow.
Wow. Right.
Well, any final observations that anyone would like to offer before we draw to a close?
Come, Holy Spirit.
Well, I mean, is it any further thoughts about, yes, what you long for in the church today? John Coles.
Well, I remember David Pitches put out 2 or 3 videos, I think it was then, wasn't it? Entitled, Is This Revival? And he got a little bit lampooned for that. But it's interesting that, having just been earlier today in a meeting of church leaders in London, with a number of fairly conservative evangelicals amongst them, that some of them are now praying for revival in a way that I don't know that they have done, even thought about it that much, recognizing that we are in need of a supernatural outpouring of the Spirit if the church is to be the church, the part of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church as it's meant to be, empowered by the Spirit, and if we're to be engaged, empowered in mission in the way that the early church was. It's not just individuals on their own that need to find a renewal, but we need another movement of God, which we're all caught up in together. And while we can't engineer that, praying and praying together must be a very significant part of that.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that you mentioned David Pitches, because the next seminar in this series will be an opportunity to remember his ministry and the birth of new wine. So, John Coles, I hope it's in your diary if you are able to join us on the 22nd of February and then the 21st of March. So these are all on Thursday afternoons. The impact of the Alpha course in HTB, and we hope that Andrew Atherston will be with us then. He, of course, having written Repackaging Christianity, this remarkable history of the Alpha course. Very grateful to all of you for being part of this, and as you pray, do spare a prayer, of course. I mean, many of you are actively involved, but for the Ministry of Resource, as we seek to be part of this ongoing renewal of the church. Certainly I have found these seminars hugely stirring, not least the inspiration of what so many of you have seen and lived through with your own eyes, but the desperate need for the church in our generation to see such things again. So thank you to all of you for being part of this and being part of the support. I should say that we are very close to agreeing dates in September for an overnight consultation at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, where we're hoping to take the themes partly from these seminars, partly from the questionnaires that many of you I know have already filled in, but an opportunity to have deeper conversation and to share some of the insights from the work of the History Project thus far. So as soon as we do have a date, we will circulate it to everyone who has registered for these seminars, and we'd love to see many of you there if that is possible. And we you know, we very much hope that the wisdom that is being gathered will then be able to be disseminated in ways that really are of genuine practical use to the mission of the church today. So thank you very much indeed for being with us, and hope to see many of you in the coming months. Thank you.